Well, alrighty, I got my scrubby scrubs on and I'm going to tell you guys some of the stories that I have during my experience as a mental health hospital worker. Yeah, that'll be fun. Considering that I worked 18 months in a psychiatric hospital, and this experience is in addition to the bachelor's degree in psychology that I earned, I feel that I am in a unique position where I could ask today's question fairly, and that question is, are mental health hospitals really helpful? Well, today's notions, like most of the notions that I try to tackle on this channel, are subjective. And due to the number and variability of individual patients and hospitals, I won't be able to affirm one way or another, and say either that mental health hospitals do jack shiznit for the patients that are admitted, or psychiatric hospitals are nothing but a blessing for those who accept their services. Since I believe that both of these notions are wrong, I will primarily be using first-hand experience on why I believe that most mental health hospitals are capable of helping some people, but all mental health hospitals have areas that they can improve on. Another accurate title for this video could be Shiznit that I saw as a psychiatric technician. But first, since more accurate and scientific facts should be the basis for any underlying belief, I will first share what I found in my research before diving into my anecdotal experience. In the United States, in order for an institution to be given the official label of being a psychiatric hospital, and thereby be able to receive payment from the government's health insurance assistance program called Medicaid, an institution must be under the supervision of a doctor of medicine or osteopathy to provide psychiatric diagnosis and treatment of the mentally ill. They also must meet the general hospital requirements as specified by parts of the Social Security Act. They also need to maintain clinical and other records on all patients to determine the degree and intensity of the treatment provided to individuals entitled to hospital insurance benefits. And lastly, they also have to meet the minimum staffing requirements as the Secretary of Health and Human Services finds necessary for the institution to perform an active treatment program for its patients. So this is basically the hierarchy of a psychiatric hospital. At the very top you have the psychiatrist and the director of nursing. I believe there were 3 psychiatrists in the whole thing, but there was one time that a psychiatrist left and there was a little bit of time between him leaving and getting another one. But for a 108 patient bed, you had about 3 psychiatrists, which is reasonable and doable, but that's only the inpatient, because these psychiatrists also had to deal with all of the outpatient psychiatric patients as well. Basically what I was concerned with as being part of the hospital, part of the mental health hospital, this is what the order of chain of command that I had to follow. There was the director of nursing at the top. Under her was supervising nurse, 1 for each shift. There are about 5 to 9 nurses. There is definitely 1 nurse that needed to be at each ward. The hospital was divided into 5 or 6 wards. There was the children's unit. There was 2 adolescent units, 1 for the long-term patients called subacute, and the short-term patients, which we called acute. And then there was the adult unit, and there were 2 geriatric units, but I kind of combined them into 1 in my mind. So in order for the hospital to run at bare minimum capacity, there had to be 5 nurses, but oftentimes 5 isn't enough, and there were the subacute and acute units of the adolescents were huge. I think there was 26 on one side and 24 on the other or something like that. So 2 nurses for each of those stations would have been preferred, and also another nurse for the geriatric unit. And below the nurses, which is where I was a psych tech. I worked alongside certified nursing assistants, but the CNAs usually just stayed on the geriatric unit because that's where they were primarily needed, and you didn't need to be a CNA in order to be on any of the other 4 units. Now, whenever I said that there were going to be 10 to 18 CNAs and psych techs, 10 is working at the very bare minimum that you need to have. It is possible to work with 10, but it is highly recommended against, and if it does happen, it better happen on the night shift, because if there's only 10 CNAs and psych techs on the day shift, all hell would break loose. That's almost a guarantee. There is something weird about this hierarchy that I think I should bring mention to that the general public doesn't really know about. All of the nurses, they don't need to have any background in psychiatry in order to have their job in the psychiatric hospital. They are there for medical purposes only. The nurses are there to follow the suggested medical treatment for the psychiatric issues as prescribed by the psychiatrists. At the place where I worked, only high school graduation was required to get the job of being a psych tech. And since only high school graduation was the bare minimum requirement of getting the job as a psychiatric technician, I got to work with some interesting people. And although I am glad to have worked with half of them, the other half of them should not have been there. Some of them were almost as crazy as the patients. I was the only one as a psychiatric technician that I knew of that had a bachelor's degree in a relevant field to do this job. And I'd say during the entirety of the 18 months that I worked there, I communicated with the doctors probably a total of 3 or 4 times. One of these times we communicated was whenever they were trying to get the staff's perspective of what happened whenever a restraining of a patient had to occur. And the second time that I got to talk with the doctor was to make sure that the patient and staff relationship that was developing with a certain patient was staying on the level, because this particular patient thought highly of me, and they wanted to make sure that I knew that they thought highly of me and that it stayed on a professional level, and it did. And the last time I talked with one of these doctors was on my way out the door, and I was talking to them and laying down my concerns about the corruptness of the whole place. If these 3 interactions count for 1% of the communication that happened between me and the psychiatrist, I'd say about 89% of our communication was written on paper in the case files of the patients. And 10% of the communication that happened from doctors to me happened in a not so reliable game of telephone that happened whenever the psychiatrists met with the nurses and the nurses told us some of the information that they were told by the psychiatrists. I guess other people who were at the hospital that I didn't really write up here because they weren't really always relevant to me, but they are there. There was the cafeteria staff who had to also go through this special training in order to become cafeteria staff in a psychiatric hospital. So there's those people, and I really thank them for the work that they do. There was also 1 or 2 janitors, but that was nowhere near enough janitors for the kind of messes that happened in that place. And there was also the recreational therapist who basically, they did various recreational activities that were inclined to be therapeutic. There's the secretaries that admit people whenever they first come to the hospital, and there's also some records keepers. There's a big room in there specifically designated for keeping the records of the patients that have been there in the past. Basically, I feel like the staffing of that hospital was always in a state of lacking. There was always more work to be done than what there was staff to actually perform what needed to be done. I would suggest that in an ideal world, there would be one educated, empathetic, firm, and mentally and emotionally stable person who is there as a staff member for every 5 patients there. At least while the patients are awake, and maybe reduce it to 1 to 8 for the night shift. In the few times that a ward was sufficiently staffed to this standard, one staff member was always switched over to help that struggling ward, and rightfully so, because nobody should be struggling in that kind of work. And really, don't even get me started on the janitor shortage and the sheer amount of janitorial work that the psychiatric technicians had to perform on a daily basis. I'd say that if I had to work an 8-hour day, 2 of those hours would be spent doing janitor type work. With an overall staff shortage, if I am there doing janitor work, that hinders me from doing my primary job. And the techs need to be there. They need to be ready and alert and ready to help whenever medication alone doesn't solve the psychiatric issues. And honestly, medication alone rarely completely cures psychiatric issues. And if it did, there wouldn't be such a high return rate to the hospital for the same issues. The techs play a big part in correcting the mindsets of people who are there to seek treatment. So, I'm going to be mimicking a patient for a second, so bear with me. Oh, I'm going to go do this thing over here that is completely unhelpful, possibly will make a mess, and I really want to do it to get attention, so push! And to boot, after I do this, I will now think less of myself, and I will confirm the notion that I am in fact crazy. And after the patient does that, that's when the techs come in and redirect that behavior as best as they know how to do for that particular patient. For some patients, just a mere suggestion of a more helpful and productive course of action is enough to make that patient do those better actions. And sometimes if the action that is initially performed is violent, either towards themselves or towards other people, like restraining that patient is the right action to take. And if the techs know the patient enough, they can just flat out ignore the patient if they know that what they are doing is attention-seeking behavior. Yeah, it may sound weird to purposefully ignore patients, but it's actually a pretty effective method and has been prescribed by doctors to do so on many occasions. I would suggest that it is about disconnecting the crazy behavior from the near universal desire to enjoy human connection. Like in motivational psychology, a person's motivation to do something can best be summarized by some combination of these two actions, which is the seeking of pleasure or the escaping from pain. If a normal means of seeking a pleasure doesn't get the desired result, some humans and animals can revert to a more abnormal means of attempting to attain that pleasure. And if normal means of escaping a pain doesn't work, humans and animals can go through something called learned helplessness. And that mindset can be self-destructive and depressing. I could do a whole episode on motivational psychology and learning processes because those were two of my favorite classes in college. But we'll call that good for now. Now let's talk about the cost of care in these hospitals. It appears that the total amount that insurance companies, Medicare, and individuals had to pay was 2.5 times higher than the reported cost to deliver care. It would be like driving up to a McDonald's drive-thru for a $1 hamburger and being like, a $1 hamburger, I think I'll buy that. And then driving around to the cashier and the cashier being like, that'll be $2.50 please. And then you'd be like, what? Heck to the no. So to be admitted into a psychiatric hospital, the average cost per day is $865 with a range being from $767 to $1,097. That range being a range of averages. It would be nice if we had a little menu like this that we could go to for a hospital, wouldn't it? But this doesn't happen. And the overall lack of clarity and assurance of pricing for this kind of issue makes it challenging to give a hard estimate for the cost per day to be in a psychiatric hospital. I mean, I think it would be good if hospitals in general started making a menu like this. Make that pricing public. And it would also be nice if they kept this price the same regardless of who is paying it. Like, they shouldn't just jack up the prices just because an insurance company is paying for it. That's part of the reason why insurance premiums go up, is because hospitals don't really have anything stopping them from jacking up prices to bleed insurance companies from their money, which ultimately gets money sucked out from you, the insurance buyer. We expect transparency when we buy our food, when we rent out a hotel room, when we ride an airplane, when we receive our paychecks. So why do we allow this great lack of transparency when it comes to seeking health for our physical and mental ailments? It's kind of bullshit if you ask me. But now it's story time. Some will make you laugh, some will make you angry, some will just make you informed about what happens in the inner workings of a mental health hospital. So one of my favorite stories is one time I was working on the night shift and I had to watch this very autistic kid on the adolescent unit it was pretty intense on what he was doing. He was writing the exact same thing on several sheets of paper, and every time he was done with a sheet of paper, he taped it to the wall. And by the time I had gotten there, he had already been doing this for like 8 hours. So whenever I'm going to start watching him, the entire wall is filled with the exact same writing of what he had been doing over and over and over and over again. It was very amusing to watch this level of autism. Second story is I have been kicked in the balls multiple times being on the children's unit. Whenever I woke up the little demons in the morning, my balls suffered for it. I feel like by the last time the kids kicked me, I feel like I had developed balls of steel by that time. So yeah, I can pretty much take a hit down there and just like be unfazed. Okay, I'm still phased, but it doesn't hurt nearly as much as it used to. Another story is also working on the night shift. We are provided one meal, and since we came in at 11 and we didn't get to eat from the hospital until we took the patients to breakfast. And breakfast was the night shift's dinner or whatever. And for every freaking day, there was eggs of some sort. There was not a single day I worked there that eggs were not on the breakfast menu. Most of the time they were scrambled. Sometimes on Saturdays there were omelets. And I enjoyed the omelets because it was more than just eggs. And the fourth story about the work of a psychiatric technician is that we had to remove the bed sheets like every freaking day. And I feel like that would have technically been part of the janitorial work, but I understand why we had to do it because the psych techs also had to search the rooms and make sure that there weren't any self-harming or other harming things within the person's possession. So it's like usually those things get checked like as they come into the hospital, but sometimes somehow they are able to acquire things. Like there was a couple times that I always had a pen on me, and sometimes I lost the pen on the units, and sometimes we had to like shut down the unit just to find these pens, or it's not always my pen, but it was usually someone else's pen. But sometimes these things pop up, these things show up, and you have to search thoroughly like that. And the fifth story is kind of an interesting story about a patient again. One time on the children's unit, there was a really snarky kid who was having an attitude, and then he kicked a door to the other unit, and he figured out if he kicked it hard enough he would be able to open it because all of the doors between the different units were locked and key activated that only staff members had. So the kid walked up to it, kicked it as hard as he could, and just started walking right on through like he was like some big kid. It's like, oh yeah, I'm on the adolescent unit now, I'm big stuff. It was kind of cute. It made me roll my eyes, and then we just ignored him after a while. After a while, when he, like after about the fifth time of him kicking the door, we still had to watch him and make sure that he didn't actually go through. He just kicked it open and then he walked away. It's like kicked it, walked away. He slowly regressed out of that behavior, but that was a child. And the sixth story is that one time there was a person on the adolescent unit who had cut himself pretty severely. It was deep enough that he had to go to the ER and get it patched up. What happens in those kinds of situations is that they send somebody, usually a psych tech, to accompany the patient and make sure that they do not acquire stuff from the outside, and because they are still treated as a patient of the psychiatric hospital, but they are not sufficiently equipped for the big medical emergency stuff. Like there's a lot of smaller clinics that are not efficiently equipped for that kind of stuff either, because that's for the big ER hospitals. So I accompanied him in the ambulance to the hospital. We were there about 45 minutes an hour. And then somehow during that time, he had grabbed a scalpel and hid that on him. I don't know how he did it because I never took my eyes off of him. So the fact that he was able to grab that while I was constantly watching him. Hey, if you were able to get that while I was constantly watching you, kudos to you. Of course, he actually just gave it up because he didn't want to get me in trouble. And that was his reason for giving it up. It's like, it wouldn't be worth it. I just want to show you that I got this. It's like, okay, thank you. I'm glad I have that sort of relationship with you, that it is that simple for you to just give up your knives like that. And story number 7, which will make you want to go, huh? Basically, I was a psychiatric technician, not a CNA. And you know how earlier I told you that CNAs are only allowed to work on the geriatric unit? A couple of times, like 2 or 3, maybe 4 times. I was sent to the geriatric unit to work on the geriatric unit. I mean, sometimes staff shortages are so bad that it's like, okay, we do not have sufficient even CNAs to work this unit, so we need to have an extra hand over here just to basically keep an eye out and be that extra pair of eyes to make sure that one person isn't there alone. That's basically why I went over there. Honestly, being on the geriatric unit was kind of sad and depressing because, basically, as far as frequency of peeing oneself, there's kids on the children's unit who pee their bed every night. Every once in a while you get an adolescent or an adult that does it, but it's not very often. But on the geriatric unit, 80% of patients ended up peeing themselves during the night, and it's kind of sad to watch almost like the full cycle of mental health, right there in the same hospital where you have the kids peeing themselves, and then they learn to control themselves, but then as they learn to get older, they lose it again. Story number 8 is a couple of times while I was at the hospital, not on my watch, but while I was at the hospital, a couple of patients at different times successfully escaped from the hospital. And one of those times a patient got half a mile away before getting caught. So story number 9 is one that is interesting to me because it was within the last month of me working there, and I was working on the subacute unit on the day shift, and basically I was put in charge of putting a psychiatric education kind of thing. And a lot of the times psych techs had to BS what they had done during the psych ed thing, but whenever I said, hey, Tim, you are going to be put in charge of this psych ed today. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, what am I going to do? And basically what I taught them was what I'm going to show you right now. This isn't exactly what I said, but the general idea is there. The reason why bad habits and bad actions happen may or may not start with a bad action, but that's what we'll start with. Like, you do a bad action. Let's say the bad action is you failed to do your homework. You go in the next day and you realize, oh shoot, I had homework to do. And you feel guilty and you feel shame. That's like, oh, I should have done this and I didn't. It's like, I am here in your class, but I did not do what you wanted me to do, oh teacher. And you attempt to reconcile that behavior because of the guilt and shame motivates you to try to, okay, I do not like these feelings of guilt and shame, so I'm going to try to steer myself in a way that can pay back whatever bad action that I caused. But you will never be able to fully pay back for the wrong action that you did. It's because perfection is impossible that leads you back into being more likely to forget of homework again. Even if you remember your homework, you're like, I'm already not going to be perfect, so what's wrong with not doing one more homework assignment? And then it can just kind of snowballs and can keep on going until you are an F student. This can apply to many different attributes and actions. Say you murder someone, you feel guilt and shame unless you're a psychopath, which those people do exist and they did show up in the hospital. But for most people, if you kill someone, you feel guilt and shame, and you try to reconcile that behavior, at least in your own mind, that, okay, I killed this person, I was probably not the best thing to do, I will either turn myself in, do all these other kinds of things, and assuming you're not caught, you'll never be able to pay back the person's who you murdered's family from getting their loved one back. You'll never be able to fully repay. So you kill their family also. You need to break this cycle somehow. Like for some people, psychopaths, the cycle breaks here. They do the bad action, but they feel no guilt or remorse that they did those bad actions. So you can either break it off here and be a psychopath. If you feel guilt and shame, you should try to reconcile that behavior for the most part, but you don't have to. Just because you do it wrong doesn't mean that you have to pay back. It can make you be kind of a jerk sometimes. That's where I personally cut it off at, is after the guilt and shame, it's like, I'm sorry, won't do that again, and just leave it at that. It's like, very rarely do I feel enough guilt and shame that I have to reconcile the behavior that I performed, probably because I haven't done anything of a significant bad action in a good while. But I'd say this is like, at this point, is realizing that perfection is impossible is the easiest place to stop the cycle that would go back for you to repeating the bad behavior. Say the bad action is smoking. You feel guilt and shame for smoking because you know that smoking is bad for you. Like, everybody knows smoking is bad for you. Then you try to reconcile that behavior by smoking less. But perfection is impossible. So just because you feel an urge, like if you take one smoke after that, that doesn't mean that you have to like continue doing that. You don't even need to do that one action, because it's like, it's impossible. But you shouldn't set yourself at such a high cold turkey standard that if you do smoke, like, you shouldn't have to feel guilty or shame about not doing the, like, you slipped into the bad action once. Big whoop. Don't make a pattern of it. If you're depressed and you have bad feelings about yourself, instead of a bad action, let's have it as a bad thought instead. I am a terrible person. You feel guilt and shame about some of the things that you do that confirm in your mind that you are in fact a terrible person. And in fact, you are not actually a terrible person, because you always do the reconciling behavior that always makes people always see the general goodness of you as a person rather than the badness that you think that is always inside your head. So if you want to talk to me further about something that you thought about for your personal life within this, you can leave a message for me in the comments, or you can even send an email to me on my Gmail account. Alright, the last story. This is basically the last story of me working in a psychiatric hospital, because it is the story that led to me being fired. For not a good reason, might I add. But it's a story nonetheless. The daily part of the psychiatric hospital is that they have these check-in observation sheets, what we call CNOs. And we had to log down for every single patient every 15 minutes what they were doing, which was summarized by a number, like 1 was standing, 2 was sitting, 3 was laying down, 4 was sleeping, and where they were, like R for room, CL for classroom, O for outside. Be doing any of those actions within any of those locations, and then you put your initials next to it. I guess it'd also be good to remind you that these records are very important for the psychiatric hospital in order to maintain their status as being a psychiatric hospital, because these are one of those records things that needs to be held in order for the patient to be good enough to get their insurance from Medicaid. In order for the hospital to receive payment from insurance or Medicaid, they need to have these CNOs completely filled out, like every 15 minutes. Now what happened like every single day, like without fail, is that these CNOs, like, you know where all the patients are, but you cannot write it on the paper at the very moment that they expect it to be written down, because the patients are up, around, and moving, and you need to have your attention focused on the patients so that things don't go crazy. Like that, if there was any time to be alert, like the times whenever they are up and moving from one place to another as a group, those are the times that you need to be completely alert about what is going on. So what happened is that the lead tech, that she had an eye out for me. She was going to get me fired. Like I rubbed her the wrong way. I mean, of course, because I cast out demons and she has a big demon inside of her. But anyways, she pretty much waits for a time, like one of those times that she knows very well that every psychiatric technician has to go through. She grabbed the stack of CNOs while I was watching the patients and while they were doing their thing, and I go in there to fill them out. I'm like, where are my CNOs? Like, this is the time I need to be filling them out while it's still fresh on my mind. And apparently she had taken the whole stack, took it to the director of nursing, and they basically called me out and they said, well, these were not filled out exactly on the 15, and we have to give you a write-up for that. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to get a write-up for something that we have to literally do every day, and especially not at this time whenever I have a darn good reason why I did not fill them out at the exact moment that you expect them to be filled out, because the patients needed my eyes on them, not on the paper. It's one of those things that is like, do you value paperwork more, or do you value the quality of treatment of your patients? Obviously, me being the empathetic guy I am, I obviously choose the quality of the patient care over paperwork. I still get the paperwork done. Like, I'm very meticulous about the paperwork, but patient care always should come first. Pretty much stood up for myself and I said, no, that's not right, because if you try to get me on this, you'll get me again on this tomorrow and the next day. Like, if you want to try to get me on this, you will get me out of here within a week. That's a universal psychiatric thing. They need to fill these out every 15 minutes, but you can't, because you're also there observing in the flesh, watching where the patients are, what they are doing, and making sure that they're not going cray-cray. Which at that point, they just lead me out the door. I leave my keys there, leave my badge there, and they said that they would call me back in a week and they would decide whether they were going to fire me or keep me. And they fired me after I found out a week later, but F that place. F it. Which after they led me out, that pretty much led to the conversation that I had with the doctor the last time, and she was a good psychiatrist, good lady. She knew very well of the corruption that is going on in the place, and that is, like, me being fired, clearly one of the best techs that were there, like being fired off of an issue that happens literally all the time. I conveyed that to the psychiatrist. This is basically her response, like, what can you do about it? What can you do about it? So, are mental health hospitals really helpful? I'll leave that up to you to decide. It really depends on your personality, your openness to change, your social class, your impressionability, your age, your illness, and the individual hospital that is providing the treatment. But viewer discretion is advised whenever forming an opinion that is always yes or always no to this question. But anywho, hopefully as a result of a little bit of additional research in conjunction with a bunch of personal experiences, we can start a movement to reform mental health hospitals, to have a higher success rate at treating people with debilitating mental health issues, and not just temporarily relieve patients in distress to all but ensure that they come back to the hospital to receive treatment later and give them more money. This video was made by Tim and Kindness Snavely on a channel called Death of a Notion, and definitely not by crazy people. Well, maybe. I guess I'll give her credit, since because of her sharp wit, it made me realize that a lot of the notions that I held on to are not really worth holding on to. And because of that, I will keep giving her credit. But if you would like to become more enlightened, depressed, enraged, or thoughtful with us, depending on your previous notion, please do us a giddy and click on those like and subscribe buttons, and join our fellow sea creatures who live in the Notion Ocean. And until next time, kumbaya, mother duckers. I am crazy. Yeah? Yeah? He's like, yeah, you definitely wouldn't want me as a psych patient because I would definitely escape if I didn't want to be there.